If you're listening to this, it's another Thursday release of episode 254, Into the Harvest podcast this week. We want to talk to you about making disciples, but maybe help you think about it differently. So when it comes to making disciples, the default approach in modern Christianity is use preaching and pastoring. These modes are, of course, important and they're biblical, but they tend to focus on preventing heresy and hurt. When we look to Jesus, we see he modeled parenting as his primary role for disciple making. This leads to disciple making and discipleship that's relational, it's ongoing, and patient in allowing young believers to make mistakes and to work through hurts. So if we want to make disciples, we need to think and operate like parents. So Andrew, we've been talking about this idea for a little while. We really have these great opportunities every Wednesday where we spend time together processing life and ministry, what God's teaching us. And this topic, the 3 Ps, I don't know if you get made fun of, Andrew. I get made fun of all the time. I got 3 Ps and 5 Cs and whatever, but 5 As. There's all these different things that we use. But these 3 Ps of preaching, pastoring, and parenting, something that has come up in just us processing life and ministry and the idea of disciple making, what you're seeing in the church and what we're seeing in different generations. So maybe kind of pull our readers into kind of what that conversation looked like for us and why we landed on this topic this week.
Yeah, so you're right, John. The funny thing is we don't even try to set out to make 3 Ps. It just kind of happens. I don't know if that's because we've rewired our brains. But really, anytime we're using something like this, it's really to give people handles to hang on to the principles that we're covering in a conversation like this. You and I had this conversation maybe a month or two back, and it was so helpful for us that we thought this would be a good conversation just to have for the podcast. And so when you're doing podcasting, sometimes you're thinking about what would be a good topic to cover or a good guest to have on. Other times you're just in the harvest, you're making disciples, you're coming up against challenges. And as you work through those, you realize this would probably be really helpful to have this conversation at a broader level. And so we're doing that with this episode of the podcast. But this really came out of a local conversation that we were having here in San Diego as we make disciples. And we're trying to navigate, we were creating a resource to help young disciple makers, new disciple makers begin meeting up with younger believers and sharing their faith. And that was a great exercise because these things actually came into tension. I wouldn't say conflict, but the folks who are primarily pastors or pastoral in their outlook and in their emphasis would see things at a certain value. Others who are preachers, they're going to have a certain desire for that tool to look a certain way. And then for me, with my background of one-to-one disciple making, I realized that why am I in tension with these other points of emphasis? And I think it's because I have come up and learned to see disciple making as more of a parenting centered approach to training and discipling others. And so that's really the background of it. And as we wrestled through that here locally, it actually gave us some great insights on the challenges that we face as we make disciples, and these 3 things of pastoring, preaching, and parenting.
Andrew, I think, as you're talking about how this came about, I think it's really important from the very outset of this to say that the idea is to be faithful. All of these are trying to steward God's people and to help people mature and grow. They just might have a little different emphasis. And so that's what was kind of our struggle as we kind of pushed back and forth with these conversations. And you had to respond to emails and, well, let's add this to the document. And we need these resources to the document. And so, oh man, now we don't even know what we're talking about. There's so many things on this piece of paper to help people learn how to follow up and make disciples that, man, what is our focus? And then actually what it did for both of us is it helped us say, like, well, why don't we worry about that? Why don't we think or approach things that way? And that's the spirit in which we hop into this conversation. So we want to make sure from the very beginning, we're not against preaching. We're not against pastoring. That is not what we're talking about at all. But instead, We want to help bring a fuller picture of what that understanding is. In order to kind of create that tension, though, we're going to talk about what the dominant models are in our culture.
Right. And we're actually going to finish this conversation. I hope folks will stick around to the end, because we're going to finish by talking about how all these integrate: the pastoring approach, the preaching approach, the parenting approach. But what we're going to say here at the outset is that parenting needs to drive the train. The parenting mindset, the parenting attitude, the parenting approach needs to be front and center in how we go about making disciples. And you touched on it at the very beginning when we did the intro to this episode. If we have pastoring as the dominant attitude and approach, then our desire is going to be to prevent hurt. If we have preaching as the dominant attitude and approach, then our attitude is going to be to prevent heresy. So as we're going about making disciples, we're going to be trying to prevent people from experiencing hurt, or we're going to try to prevent people from falling into heresy. Now, we don't want people to be hurt. We don't want people to fall into heresy. So again, we're not saying that we're against those. We're just saying that those are not the primary considerations when we are going about making disciples. So what do you think about those statements, John, and just kind of how we've set it up, and what would you add to that?
Andrew, I think these are great things, right? We don't want hurt or heresy, but we also need to recognize that those can come at a cost. So our desire to kind of make sure that people don't teach the wrong thing or don't understand the wrong things actually can make things overcomplicated. So we've talked about how disciple makers, Jesus, Paul in the scriptures, they took these gigantic concepts and they simplified them so that people could follow. We've often described the idea of disciple making is what happens in the in-between moments. I go to church on Sunday, I have Bible study on Wednesday. How do I live my life in the in-between moments? So when there's just kind of this focus on preaching and pastoring, you get these concepts, right? But sometimes they don't come back to this place where it's simplified and people can actually live by it. So it just becomes overly complex. So we talk about that a lot. So and the people that are preaching, they have tons and tons of training, right? They spent time studying the word and the original languages, and there's themes and things that they spent their life studying that they're wanting to give to people and making sure that doctrine is tight. But sometimes that can actually make it really complicated and difficult to understand. So that's the first thing I'd say.
Yeah, so the one way that we say this is that you can't start young disciples at 301. You have to have that 101 level. And that's another way of saying we don't want to overly complicate, or we're not trying to cover all of the doctrinal in and outs in the 101. And that was really this tool that we've created here locally. It is a 101 tool that we're using to help people. And so we call it the core four things to know, 4 things to grow. But by definition now, we're reducing this to 4 things. So what are 4 things that we want a young believer or even a seeker to know about God and his purposes? Well, of course, there's much more than 4 things. So by design, this is going to be 101. This is going to be something that gets people started. It's not going to give them all the answers or all the ins and outs. And then there's 4 things to grow. These are things that will help me mature in my faith. So yeah, we want to start 101 with people. And sometimes if we're coming at it from a preaching mindset or attitude, we really want folks to have all the information, and it can make that initial step for young believers too big. So sometimes I think of growth and growing in our faith as stepping over gaps. You know, we're moving from where we're at in the present, and we have to make a leap to grow to the next level of maturity. And those gaps have to be manageable. So if we start people out 301, the gap is just too big. People get overwhelmed. They begin to think, I just can't understand the Bible. Or, sometimes this will happen. You're having a Bible conversation with a younger believer, and they say something that is not doctrinally correct. They've got a misunderstanding about some truth, and maybe it's a very important truth on, say, the divinity of Christ. And it could be any number of things. We've probably all experienced this. And the preacher mode in me will immediately want to correct that because I know it's not true. It's like, actually, that's not true. That's actually heresy. But the parenting aspect will say, this is a very young believer who's devoted to the Lord, and I know that they're growing. So this is going to come into focus for them as we move forward in this relationship and as they move forward in their growth. The parenting mindset will, similar to our physical kids, when our kids say something that we know is not the way the world works, it's not true, maybe they mispronounce something, so it could even just be the way they're saying it. We don't get too concerned about it because we recognize where they're at in their maturity. Now, we don't ignore it. We want to help them grow, but we might not correct that doctrinal misstatement in the moment. As a disciple maker who's coming from a parenting bias, I'm going to take note of it. Like, okay, that's something I want to help them come to understand, but I'm not going to correct them in front of these other 4 people because they didn't say it exactly right. So that's just kind of like an example of having a parenting dominant view of disciple making versus a preacher dominant view. If I come with a preacher dominant, I mean, my greatest concern is heresy, and therefore I'm going to feel like I need to correct that and get it dialed in. And then what happens is people stop sharing. Young believers stop sharing because they don't have it all figured out. So what am I really trying to get at? So that's kind of what the preaching dominant approach will be. But like we said, with pastoring, if I have that dominant view, then I'm really trying to prevent hurt. So maybe share a little bit about how that can actually unintentionally work against growth and disciple making, John.
Into the Harvest is a nonprofit ministry made possible by generous partners who believe Jesus is alive today and still calling people to follow him. Their monthly support helps disciple making grow and thrive around the world. If Into the Harvest has made an impact in your life and you want to help share the good news of Jesus with others, join us today and become a monthly giving partner. Visit intotheharvest.org/give.
Yeah, this happens a lot, Andrew. And we just wrote in our notes, this is kind of overprotection, right? If you kind of have this picture of like what do they call those? Like a helicopter mom, helicopter parent who's constantly always wanting to protect their kid from making a mistake or whatever. So this overprotection, what it actually does is it can actually really stymie growth because, well, no, watch out for that. Or so I'd often tell this story. I was discipling a young man, actually with the same age, I guess. He was young. Now we're both old, I guess. But so his name's Levi. He's been on the podcast with us, but God gave him this very unique small group for a season. And all of these men in that small group are these very like theologically minded, very careful people. And Levi would make a simple statement like how important it is to memorize the scriptures. And immediately a guy was like, "Oh, hey, you got to be careful about that." "Oh, hey, you got to." So it's almost, so Levi eventually was like, "Oh, so we shouldn't memorize the scripture. We shouldn't study the Bible." I'm like, "Oh, yeah, that's a good point." So what this actually can do is, if we're even in pastoring, as we're trying to keep people from the idea of performing and that becoming your identity, or kind of putting on something on them too soon, and realizing that can actually create hurt. Sometimes you can't get it right without getting it wrong. And this idea of shielding people from making these mistakes actually can be overly protective and can actually really stymie growth. So someone who has that pastoring mindset is very much so about wanting to protect the sheep. But that's just an important tension in disciple making, is that protection and preparation. They have to find a togetherness when it comes for us becoming disciples. So you can shield people from making mistakes. You think you're actually helping them, but sometimes you're actually overly protective and they don't make the mistakes they need to get it right later on.
Yes, and this is one way this works against growth is people are going to get it wrong, especially as they start to live out their faith. And as they start to share their faith, I was meeting up with a young group of disciples that I'm working with right now. And all of these guys are in the very early stages of wanting to reach out and make disciples themselves. And so that at the very beginning of the disciple making, they've known the Lord for a while. Now they're wanting to learn how to share their faith and make disciples, pass that on. And I actually shared with them on this that you will make mistakes. So the example I gave was my 19-year-old son was changing his oil this last weekend in his car. And I was out of town, so he's texting me. Now he's helped me change the oil. I've helped him change the oil, but this was his first solo oil change. And it was kind of hilarious because it was about a 3-hour long process of like texting back and forth, not nonstop, but he would text me, where is this tool? Where's this part? Hey, I can't get the bolt loose. Okay, get the cheater bar. This is what it looks like. This is where it's at in the garage. He gets the bolt off. Okay, I can't get the filter off. Okay, get the oil filter wrench. It's on this side of the toolbox. I send him a picture of what it looks like. So it's funny because they got the oil changed. It all worked out. But it probably took, 10 times what it might have taken, how long it should have taken. But the next time he changes his oil, it's probably going to take him 30 minutes because now he's done it. And I think so many of us with disciple making, we're not letting people struggle through those initial attempts at sharing their faith and making disciples and making the mistakes. And it can be brutal to watch if you're an older discipler and you're watching this young disciple maker you're like, man, you were making this way harder than it needs to be. But if we don't let them go through that, then we aren't going to develop mature disciple makers and mature leaders for the church. And we talked about this, comparing it to in the physical world, having young children. And, if you teach your child how to walk, then they might skin their knee. They probably will, actually. They might even start playing sports. They might break their leg. It's still worth teaching your kid to walk. So in the same way as spiritual parents, we expect there to be hurts that come along the way. Now, John, what's the counter argument is that why do people who have that pastoring mindset and default approach, why would they want to prevent hurt? Based on what we were talking about with staying with people along the way, if we don't do that.
You're always trying to head something off at the pass, right? So lots of folks who have this pastoring mindset, they think, well, I've had to counsel people with this problem or this pain or this event that happened to them, and they misinterpreted certain things from the Bible or ended up taking kind of and having a performance mentality, and their identity is placed in the wrong thing. And then there's an undoing, like, oh, this is going to take so long to undo the harm that was created by this issue or that issue. So folks who have that pastoring mindset are saying, well, let's take the long-term view, knowing that, hey, let's slow roll this out to make sure that we teach this correctly and we protect so that we can avoid the hurts and the pains. But I'm just often reminded, and I think that's a great thing, but I'm often reminded that in this world you will have trouble, right? But take heart, I've overcome the world. So we can actually move too quickly to this place of, okay, I can keep the trouble. And if we teach this correctly, they'll never actually fall into this trouble or these problems. So oftentimes we think about, I can protect them from that, but I wonder really if Jesus is like, well, I want to help them become tougher for whatever might come their way. And James chapter 1 talks about that. Romans chapter 5, 1-5 talks about that. Perfect and complete, ready for anything that comes their way. And he's talking about trials and challenges that come in life. So I think there's a real heart there to protect and know, and our experience is, oh man, when you get that wrong, that you have to really pay for that. That will be a challenge in your life. Let's get that right. So,
yeah, and what we're saying, the parent, he does address hurts. So the pastor is addressing hurts, the parent is addressing hurts. But most times pastors are addressing hurts when things have gone way off the rails and like there's crisis, the person's world is shutting down. but they're probably 5 steps into the hurt before it even comes on the radar. And so I think sometimes people who have that pastoring experience and mindset, they do elevate preventing hurt to a higher level because what they're seeing is really deep hurt that people have experienced, sometimes at the hands of the church. Whereas the parent, what I would say is that we're making micro adjustments as the person is growing. So, okay, we see a mistake, it causes hurt, we step into that. Let's say it's interpersonal. This young leader dealt with an issue in the wrong way, in a way that wasn't in step with the gospel, and ended up creating conflict between themselves and other believers. Okay, let's step into that right away. And now we're addressing it, and that hurt is actually becoming part of God's development plan for this young believer, this young leader, so that it never, hopefully, this is the hope, it never gets to that massive problem that we often see in churches where people are leading in the church that haven't been discipled. Maybe they've been through seminary, and yeah, they're leaving a trail of bodies in their wake because no one's ever given them those micro adjustments, and now they're leading at a much larger level. They haven't really been developed. So let me just ask our listeners, our viewers, do you agree with this statement that pastoring and preaching are not adequate as the primary basis for disciple making, that they're important, but they can't be what's driving the ship? And if you do or don't agree, tell us why in the comments here on YouTube. But John, let's shift into a deeper focus on what we do mean by the parenting approach and how we see Jesus modeling this approach versus the pastoring or the preaching dominant way to make disciples.
What does it really mean to follow Jesus and help others to do the same? Discipleship 101 is a free 8-part video series with a downloadable guide designed to help you live as a disciple of Jesus and make disciples in everyday life. In it, we explore what discipleship is, why it matters, and how Jesus calls us to grow, endure, and multiply our faith. Whether you're mentoring one person or leading a group, this resource gives you clarity and practical steps to start right where you are. Visit www.intotheharvest.org/discipleship101 and take your next step as a disciple and a disciple maker.
Andrew, I love the invitation that he gives the disciples, right? So come follow me and I'll make you fishers of men. We talk about this. One of our favorite tools is the call to follow. This invitation that Jesus gives us. And because he knows he's going to spend life and he's going to spend time with them, he's going to see them interact with him, with other people, with each other, he doesn't fear misunderstanding. Because he's going to live with his disciples, he's going to let them grow through experience, right? So Mark chapter 4, it says that is it Mark 3? 3:14, excuse me. He says he called them that they might be with him, right? So the whole idea is he's not worried about kind of correcting or downloading the right things to them right away because he knows he's going to live life. Though he does do that in Matthew chapter 5, right? He basically kind of ushers in, hey, this is the way the kingdom works. This is the right perspective I want you to have about the kingdom of God. Here is my value system. Here's some things that you think you kind of sort of know, but here's the depth of this lesson deep in your heart. And then he doesn't say come back next week, right? He actually says, hey, let's go live this out together. And so you see these things kind of working in concert where Jesus is actually spending active time really teaching some very deep concepts. One of the phrases he says, therefore be perfect like your heavenly Father is perfect. You're like, what in the world is he talking about here? Then he talks about peacemakers and all these different things that are very challenging concepts. Hey, you think the problem is adultery and actually committing a sexual act. I'm telling you, lust is your problem. The way you think about women and process them. He takes these concepts and he makes them really deep. And then he doesn't necessarily check on learning necessarily. Then he says, okay, well, let's go live this out. Let's go see how this actually works in the real life. So I love that about Jesus. He's always our model. And arguably, regardless of the audience, it's hard not to be impressed with the person of Jesus. But once again, he's our model for disciple making. He did preach. There wasn't any instance where he wasn't pastoring and looking over the souls of his disciples. But all of that was under this umbrella of, I'm with you. I'm going to parent with you along the way. And so the primary way that we see Jesus operating was one as a parent.
Yes, and I think one way we could see this is that, or one way we could say this is that Jesus was comfortable with his disciples misunderstanding even who he is. I mean, most of his time with the disciples, they didn't really get who he is. It always cracks me up in John's gospel during the Last Supper discourse between Jesus and his disciples. Like in chapter 16, you're like, now we understand who you are. It's like they're literally at the very end of their time with him. And even then they didn't actually understand who he was. Or in Acts chapter 1, where they ask him, is it at this time that you're going to restore the kingdom to Israel? No, that's not the goal. That's not the mission right now. So he's literally ascending and leaving them, and they still are fuzzy on what exactly his plans and intentions are. So Jesus, first, because he was coming from a parenting bias, as we're describing it, the way that manifested was he was comfortable with them not having complete understanding and actually having misunderstanding, having the wrong understanding in the moment, at any given moment. And also he was comfortable with them taking the wrong actions. So, they're arguing about which one of them is the greatest. And Jesus lets them have the argument. He doesn't step in. He knows what's happening. They get to the end of the journey and he asks them, what were you guys talking about? So he doesn't step in and immediately correct the misapplication of what it means to be a follower and someone living under the kingdom of God. He lets it happen, but then he does address it. And same thing with their understanding. One of our passages that we wanted to reference was out of Mark chapter 4. Let me just read these verses. Very famous. Jesus gives his teaching on the parable of the sower. I'm just going to read a few verses from chapter 4, verses 10 through 13 here. It says that when Jesus was alone, the 12 and the others around him asked him about the parables. He told them, the secret of the kingdom of God has been given to you, but to those on the outside, everything is said in parables, so that they may be ever seeing, but never perceiving, and ever hearing, but never understanding. Otherwise, they might turn and be forgiven. Then Jesus said to them, don't you understand this parable? How then will you understand any parable? And you see there that Jesus, there's a lot to study, but first of all, he gives this teaching, and the teaching itself is inadequate. Most of the people who heard the teaching of the sower didn't really understand what it was that Jesus was driving at. So if your goal as a preacher is to have full understanding among your listeners, then Jesus failed in that moment of being a preacher. But Jesus was doing something different. He was using this as a filter to find out, well, who would actually seek the deeper understanding, the true meaning. And it ended up being, not surprisingly, his disciples and some others, in addition to his 12, that wanted to know, what does this mean? And then Jesus begins to explain. And so we see here that Jesus he's comfortable with folks not fully getting it, but he's willing to go deeper with those who want that understanding, just as we would with a parent. I mean, if you're parenting your kids, sometimes you have truth that you want to communicate to them, but they're not interested in hearing it. I mean, you'll see this especially with teenagers. There are conversations that you need to have that your kid is not ready to have. And you can say those words to him, but what you're really trying to do is guide them to a place where they're willing to listen, they're willing to learn, and sometimes they have to make some mistakes and go through some hard times before they reach that point.
Looking to take your first steps in following Jesus or help someone else do the same? Finding Faith is a free resource from Into the Harvest built around one short video and 3 simple lessons from Galatians 2:20. It's a practical way to explore the gospel and what it really means to live by faith in Jesus. Get it today for free at intotheharvest.org/findingfaith.
Andrew, I love this. I was just on a trip with my 10th grader, to Washington, D.C., and was just talking with one of the other parents about just how important preparation and protection is. And so when you think about Jesus and how he interacted with the disciples, he had to have a plan that would not fail. We're talking about the salvation of the entire world. There had to be messengers to carry this forward, to make disciples who make disciples who make disciples. So we're right here talking about Jesus. And so parenting for Jesus meant he could protect and prepare at the same time. So, hey, watch out for the yeast and the leaven of the Pharisees, right? Do what they say, but don't do as they do. That's a protection. And other times he's like, hey, go out there. Well, we couldn't cast out this demon, Okay, well now it's, hey, this can only come out with prayer and fasting. There's a preparation part to it. And then when he leaves, right, he's saying, all right, it's good that I leave. You'll now have the Holy Spirit. You have been prepared. Teach them to obey everything I've commanded you. And surely I'm with you always to the end of the age. So when we think about this, hopefully in parenting, that's something, if you're a parent, that you're holding those two things in tension. Protection and preparation. If you overly protect, they're underprepared. If you lean the scales the other way and they're overly prepared, sometimes they've seen and experienced some things that can be deeply challenging and are hard to recover from. Right? So we want to kind of walk that tightrope. And Jesus did that by love and by life. Those disciples were convinced that Jesus was for them, had a purpose for their life, engaged with not only them, but also their extended family. There's times in which Jesus is actually healing the family members of the disciples. There was a real deep commitment of love. But really, all of that got warmed up and clarified by, okay, what did Jesus do? How did he do that? Hey, remember when he said that? Yeah, what was that teaching he said? And it all was in the moment, in real time. Because you just can't sit down long enough, Andrew, to get everything that you can get from Jesus, right? What is John's phrase? He says he didn't think that all the books in the world, could really encompass all of who Jesus is and what all Jesus taught them. That's because there was so much life experience wrapped in it. And so many more things that happened with Jesus and disciples that we actually don't have record of, which is all of these kind of, you used this phrase before, like these micro changes or these micro in the moment shifts that he was doing with them as they walked. And as he was obedient to the Father.
Yeah, the word, the $10 word that comes to mind is embodiment. Jesus made disciples through embodiment, which meant and this I think is true for parenting. The parenting approach respects time and experience as necessary for growth. Time has to pass, so you can't just give. It's not like the Matrix where you can just download all the right doctrine, plug a cord into the back of someone's head and now they understand Jesus. Time has to pass. People have to be able to figure it out and sort through it. And experience is essential, that they have to make mistakes, be corrected, try again. Again, we see this with physical child rearing, and it's a parallel to spiritual child rearing or disciple making, is that we want to stay with people over a period of time, and we want as much as possible for them to be engaged because that's how they're going to get experience. So it's not just time with us talking at them. We're actively looking for ways to challenge them to step up and to grow, and this could be in their personal lives. So it could be something as simple as, I'm challenging you to get up 15 minutes earlier than you normally do to start your day reading the scriptures, drawing near to God, praying and committing your way to him before you launch into your day. Okay, that's an experience thing that I'm challenging them to have an experience, which is going to shape and inform their growth. And again, sometimes we're so afraid of, for instance, works-based salvation. I've known people that wouldn't even do that. Well, I don't want someone to feel like they've got to do that in order to be a good Christian. That's not even the point. We're not, we're talking about growing and coming to know God. And why would you withhold an opportunity for someone to do that? Again, they don't have to accept your challenge. You're challenging them. They may say no. And okay, like I'm not going to make you do it. But if you want to grow, this is one of the things that will help you grow. And our 4 to know, 4 to grow is scripture. Daily time in the scripture will help you grow. So let me challenge you to do that. Or it might be to give, to put God first in your finances. Now I'm challenging them to have an experience. And I'm trusting the Holy Spirit to come alongside and convict them on the things that they need to step up and step into in their life. So Jesus did this. He stayed with people over a period of time. Like you said, he loved them, he shared life with them, and he challenged them to step out in ways that would allow them to grow because they were having these experiences.
Yeah, Andrew, this, we wrote here in our notes that the goal isn't polished doctrine, but instead it's formation and growth. And so our number 4 boy, his name's Judah, and Judah, he's allowed to buy lunch, once a week at school, right? So we just can't afford to buy lunch every week, for every day that he goes to school. But we'd find that once we kind of like opened the opportunity for him to buy things, he would just keep charging to his account, and it was kind of this like an impulse control thing, like, oh, I want some chips, oh man, I want to get a drink, oh, I need to get a snack, oh, cookie, yeah, the cookie looks awesome, And so you were just talking to him about it, and I just shared with him, hey, this is what we've told you can buy. He's like, yeah, but I just get in line, I just want to have this, and I want to have this, and I want to have this, and well, guess what you're trying to teach any teenage boy? You're trying to teach him self-discipline and impulse control. So Jessica and I were talking about, like, well, do we just turn off his account and tell him he's not allowed to buy anymore? I said, no, this is an opportunity. We want to help him form and grow the ability to say no to his own desires. There can be, obviously, there's consequences when he overspends and he overbuys. But for us, it was actually opportunity, right? It was opportunity for him to grow and learn an important lesson. And, we could have lectured for 20 minutes about, stewardship and money and honesty and dishonesty. Instead, we said, hey, we want to challenge you to control yourself. We're beside you as you try to learn this skill. And so it was just a way to press into that principle. And you see that with Jesus. He's just a master of this. But Paul does the same thing, right? He's like, man, we loved you so much. We couldn't just share with you the gospel. We shared our own lives as well. And that's sandwiched right in between two things in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 7. And then I believe it's 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 11. He says, we're like a nursing mother who cares for her kids. And then he says later, we were like a father who exhorted and urged his kids. Well, how do you know which one to do? Encourage like a nursing mom? Or when do you exhort and urge like a father would with his kids? How do you know? Well, the only way you know is you live life together with them, right? It's in the moment. It's in real time. So even if I can be really clear in a message that I'm preaching or teaching, I still don't have real-time feedback to see what's appropriate in the moment. And Jesus did that so well, and Paul learned that from Jesus, and he passed that on to us in 1 Thessalonians.
I think it's another reason why I love the parenting approach as the default mode of disciple making. And you're right, 1 Thessalonians 2, 7 through 11, that's a great passage for folks to check out and see how Paul himself was approaching his disciple making as a mother, as a father. And one of the lessons there is, how did you learn how to parent your 5 children, John? Well, you had some reference point because you're parents, so you could think back to the way it was for you. But really, the way you parent your children is on the job training. Like, you're learning how to parent in real time. it's not like you know all the ins and outs of parenting, even now. And so in the same way, I would encourage young disciple makers. This is why parenting is another reason why it's just a great way to understand what it means to make disciples, is because you're going to learn how to make disciples by making disciples. You're not going to learn how to make disciples before you start making disciples. You're going to learn as you make disciples. You're going to get better at it. And God is he's going to help your early disciples come through it. So you're not going to ruin people just because you yourself are learning as a disciple maker. Trust the Lord and step into that. But realize that you also are learning. You're learning how to make disciples. So it's part of our growth as followers of Jesus, is to be discipled, but then also to become disciple makers, because that's part of how God is going to grow us. So why don't we wrap up, John? We want to talk a little bit about how pastoring and preaching integrate with parenting. So we are not anti-preaching. We are not anti-pastoring. These are biblical ways of serving people, sharing with others, trying to help them. So let's talk about how these three actually work together.
Andrew, these are hard, right? Because everything comes at an expense, right? And you feel like you're trading something for something else, right? So there's just a couple phrases that we wrote down. We're going to risk messiness for maturity. And oftentimes, I don't know how this works for you, but I definitely want things more neat and orderly than the world operates. I'll probably always be that way. Sometimes we want that in our churches. We want that in our Bible studies. We want that in our relationships. But parenting, preaching, and pastoring realizes there's this tension and trade-off of messiness can lead to maturity. And solving those problems really quickly can actually eliminate opportunity for growth. So then, as we're teaching from the pulpit, or as we're teaching in a setting and we're trying to preach well, we realize that there might be delayed clarity, right? We could be saying it very, very clearly from the front, and it not actually be translated, but it's setting up for a conversation later. So we're looking for a long-term growth element. So we have this message. Both of us, I think, love this message. It's one of the tools that we love to share with people, called the 5 Laws of Disciple Making. And I think this is how these things kind of integrate together. And I had spent years on part of a pastoral team at one of our ministries here at Fort Bragg. And one of the things that was a traditional, like a way of thinking about the congregation or thinking about the message, was to think about who's the people in the audience. What are their needs? What are they going through right now? And lots of times that meant deployment, war, separation from spouses, kids being away from parents. So you're thinking about that as you're looking at the text, and is there comfort or is there principles here for the text? And you can overdo that, right? But one of the 5 laws of disciple making is that you have to give truth at the ability of the person to receive it, right? So we might have all these really, really deep things that God has taught us through the years, and we want to unleash and give these truths to people. But the reality is that if we don't give them their food that they need in their spiritual walk, and we're just giving them like this big gigantic steak that they can't digest, big truth steak, we're actually kind of setting them up for failure. He has this phrase, it's Skip Gray, who's with the Lord now. He says, give the disciples opportunity for exposure to the truth, commensurate with his capacity to comprehend. But this is just a big way to say, like, hey, can they really digest that? Okay, well then I need to really kind of change the way I'm preaching or teaching.
He's saying, give the baby formula.
Yeah, exactly right.
Don't give the baby a hamburger.
Yep. So I think, even when we're thinking about preaching and pastoring, we can do that with disciple making in mind, right? Which brings it back to the way that Jesus did it in parenting. So those are a couple things that I would say how those work in relationship with each other. And then that last one is, we wrote here, intercept heresy and hurt within relationship, not from the pulpit, which means it's not become catastrophic, right? There's not complete total moral failure that's happened, and now the professionals come in. Really, Andrew, all of these things I think are created by scale. and scope. We like pastoring and we like preaching because we can do it with a lot of people and we think we're going a lot of places really fast. When the reality is that Jesus's plan of parenting and disciple making was, we'll go slow, but this thing's going to blow up. We're going to go slow. We're going to go deep. We're going to trust. People are develop over time, faithfulness over time. But we're here now because of 12 men took this message forward, 11, right? Took this message forward from Jesus because he went slow. He did it within relationship, and did it with a parenting focus.
Yeah. I just want to recap these. All of that is awesome, John. And I hope people take time to listen closely to what you're saying there. But some of the things that parenting means is that, like you said, we're risking messiness for maturity. That's a calculated risk. We're getting comfortable with messiness when it comes to the growth of those that we're investing in, because we value maturity. That's what we want. We would rather have a messy home where children are maturing to adulthood than a perfect home where kids either just sit in the corner or they don't exist. And so with our churches, if they're filled with people who are maturing in their faith, there's going to be ongoing messes that get made, and we embrace that. Now, we're not wanting things to be messy. We're just accepting that this is part of what it involves to help people mature and grow. So we're going to risk messiness for maturity. That's a parenting bias. And then what you said, we're going to accept delayed clarity in order to foster long-term growth. Again, we don't want people to misunderstand the truth. We want to help them grow in their understanding. But all you got to do is look at Jesus, look at Paul, look at the early leaders of the church to see that they were working with people who had delayed clarity because the goal was long-term growth. And what holds it all together, like you said, is relationship, that we are known, we know our people, they know us, and we're walking alongside them over a period of time, making those micro adjustments to clean up messes, to head off heresy. And that's why parenting, I think, involves both pastoring and preaching, but it's the driving mindset and attitude that we're using as our approach. So any last thoughts from you, John, on how these things fit together or what we've talked about today?
I would just say, Andrew, that I'm thankful. I think we're thankful people, both you and I, Lord, that the Lord brought people into our lives that did exactly this, that they parented us spiritually, that we got to experience 1 Thessalonians 2:8, that there was an appropriate amount of a nursing mother giving comfort, appropriate amount of saying, hey, I want to encourage you, do this, man. This is important. You don't want to miss these lessons. And so if you have that right now, go all in. Go all in with that disciple maker who's saying, hey, I want to help you become a disciple. I want to help you make disciples. And if you do not have that right now, pray like crazy. Let this be at the very top of your list. God, would you bring someone into my life that will be a spiritual parent to me, that will help me day in and day out ask questions of the Bible, understand God's character, go deep in relationship with him. And Andrew, we mentioned this 5 laws of disciple making. We'll put that in the show notes, that link that goes directly to basically a list of our favorite tools in passing on the faith. But really, this all starts in prayer. We've shared this story before. I asked God to bring you into my life. I didn't name you. I didn't know you. Just as the same time you're asking God to bring me into your life. I needed a spiritual parent. You wanted to be a part of helping people grow, to be a spiritual parent, and God made that link up happen. And we've been able to repeat that process with many men over and over and over again to make disciples. So we want to exhort you, you want this. You need this, and the kingdom needs the next generation of parents that pastor and can preach, but have a parenting paradigm as they make disciples.
Absolutely, man. Well, this has been a lot of fun, John. I would love to hear from folks. Is this a helpful conversation, just a way of framing how these things fit together, parenting, with preaching, with pastoring. What are your thoughts? Where do you think you've struggled? Do you know how to parent? And what would it look like to learn from someone else? So reach out to us, leave a comment, and we'll see you next time we jump on a podcast together.
Andrew, it's fun being with you, bro.